Wendy Adelson was behind the wheel, her hands gripping the worn leather firmly, but her fingers betrayed a slight tremor. The setting sun painted the sky in a deep orange, and the deserted road cut through the arid landscape around her. The insistent ringing of her phone broke the uncomfortable silence inside the car. With a heavy sigh, she answered. "Hi, Mom." Her voice sounded weaker than she would have liked. On the other end, the familiar voice carried a mix of concern and affection, asking how things were going. Wendy took a deep breath, trying to find the right words, but the lump in her throat seemed determined to choke her. She knew her life was about to be turned upside down, and no matter how hard she tried to hide it, she couldn't fool her mother. She never could. Dawn on Trescott Drive brought with it a somber weight that hung in the air. Sirens echoed through the narrow streets, shattering the morning tranquility with a sharp, incessant sound. Attorney Daniel Martel, a respected man with an impeccable demeanor, now lay motionless inside his car, the shattered glass and blood-stained chest a stark contrast to his usual pristine appearance. The black car, always impeccably clean, now seemed like a cruel reminder of the tragedy. The neighborhood, known for its well-manicured lawns and smiling families, was overtaken by a palpable sense of fear. Amid the confusion, James Geiger, the nearest neighbor, struggled to steady his breathing as he described the scene to the 911 operator. His trembling voice betrayed the shock. I heard the shots. 3, maybe 4. And when I looked out the window, I saw the car stopped in the middle of the street, its lights flashing. The interrogation room had that typical smell of cold coffee and aged paper, mixed with a faint aroma of nervous sweat. The fluorescent lights flickered subtly, casting uneven shadows across the scratched metal table. Wendy Adelson sat with her hands clasped in her lap, her fingers moving slowly, as if trying to find something to hold on to. Across the table, Detectives Harper and Ramos observed her with the patience of those who had heard countless stories and knew exactly when someone was hiding something. "Wendy," Harper began, his voice deep and controlled, "can you think of anyone who wanted to hurt Daniel?" She took a deep breath, shifting her gaze to the one-way mirror on the wall, as if hoping to find answers there. "No, not exactly," she replied, her voice coming out almost in a whisper. "I mean, Daniel was complicated, but I don't think anyone really wanted to kill him." Detective Ramos leaned slightly forward, his pen tapping rhythmically on the notepad. "Complicated how?" he asked, his eyes fixed on her. Wendy hesitated for a moment, her gaze shifting between the two. He was a good father, a brilliant lawyer, but he was also difficult. The divorce was, well, it was a war. Harper crossed his arms, waiting for her to continue, and Wendy bit her lower lip before letting out a humorless laugh. "Charlie, my brother, once joked. He said hiring a hitman was cheaper than the divorce," she confessed, forcing a nervous smile. The silence that followed was crushing. Harper narrowed his eyes, analyzing every nuance of her expression, while Ramos quickly jotted something down. "Your brother said that?" Harper asked, trying to hide his sudden interest. Wendy nodded but quickly added, "It was just a joke. You know Charlie. He has a peculiar sense of humor." But the detectives didn't seem convinced. Harper exchanged a glance with Ramos, but to Wendy's surprise, they didn't press the issue further. Instead, Ramos leaned back in his chair and calmly asked, "And you, Wendy? Have you ever thought that solving this another way would be easier?" The insinuation was there, hanging in the air like a veiled threat. She felt her face flush, her eyes widening slightly. "No." "My God, of course not," she replied defensively, her hands tightening their grip on her own wrist. But no matter how hard she tried to sound convincing, Wendy knew they weren't buying it. Not about her brother. Not about the jokes. They were convinced she was trying to divert attention anywhere but herself. When they finally left the room, Wendy was left alone, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her mind raced, trying to figure out if mentioning Charlie had been a mistake or a desperate strategy. But one thing was certain. She could feel that, from that moment on, her life would never be the same. Daniel Martel was a man who knew how to build an impeccable image. In the courtroom, he stood out with his confident posture, impeccably tailored suits, and always persuasive speech. Fellow professionals admired him, clients blindly trusted him, and even his opponents acknowledged his sharp intelligence. But outside the courtroom, his personal life was a constant battlefield. His marriage to Wendy Adelson, which seemed so solid to outsiders, hid deep cracks. Heated arguments became frequent, and the silent nights at home were filled with unspoken resentment. At social dinners, they exchanged forced smiles, but as soon as the doors closed, the real Daniel emerged, a man tormented by frustrations piling up like overdue bills. The custody battle for the children was the tipping point for the definitive end of their marriage. Daniel saw the separation as his own Pearl Harbor, a war he could not afford to lose. He dedicated countless hours studying every detail of the legal proceedings, every loophole that could give him an advantage over Wendy. For him, it was not just about keeping custody but about winning. Close friends recalled how he talked about the divorce, as if it were a court case that had to be won at all costs. Wendy, on the other hand, described the relationship as an emotional prison. Behind the facade of their perfect home, there were intense fights, accusations of infidelity, and nights when they became mere strangers sharing the same space. Gradually, everything they had built together was crumbling. Even after the separation, tensions persisted. The text messages exchanged between Daniel and Wendy were like matches thrown into gasoline, reigniting old resentments. Wendy accused him of manipulation and excessive control, while Daniel saw her as unstable and vindictive. He reinvented himself as a successful single man, but the past was not so easily erased. Some colleagues whispered in hushed tones about his changing behavior, more irritable, impatient, and at times even paranoid. Daniel felt he always needed to stay one step ahead, whether in the courtroom or his personal life. But there was something he couldn't control. Wendy's growing hatred and the feeling that, at any moment, something could explode in his life again. And perhaps he was right. The detectives gathered in the investigation room stared at the board filled with photos, notes, and meticulously organized timelines. What once seemed like a botched robbery was now taking on far more complex contours. Each new piece added to the puzzle revealed a meticulous plan, orchestrated by someone who knew Daniel Martel's habits well. The security camera footage was a crucial breakthrough, a dark-colored Toyota Prius driving around Martel's residence in the days leading up to the crime. The car appeared at various times, sometimes in the morning, other times at night, but always maintaining a calculated distance, almost too discreet to raise immediate suspicion. The owner of that car? That was the question echoing through the room. As they analyzed the footage, investigators noticed a pattern. The vehicle seemed to track Martel's routine, observing his movements with surgical precision. In one of the most revealing recordings, the car parked on a side street, its lights off, while Daniel left his house for his usual business dinner. The driver remained in the vehicle for long minutes, perhaps assessing the options, waiting for the right moment. The cold precision of the movements demonstrated planning that went beyond an impulsive crime. Someone had planned this with time and patience. And as detectives cross-referenced data with toll records and neighbor reports, a figure began to emerge from the shadows. A name that had been mentioned before but now seemed to gain more weight: Wendy Adelson. Looking at phone records, it became evident that Wendy had been near Daniel's house more times than she had declared. Her contradictory statements were beginning to make more sense, or rather, the lack of them. The police then started connecting the dots: deleted messages, unanswered calls, a trail of movements that demonstrated a silent obsession. The Prius was just the tip of the iceberg. Detectives knew they were not dealing with a random crime. Everything indicated that whoever had planned this murder knew Martel better than any stranger ever could. And now, their mission was to prove that the lawyer's death was not just an unfortunate incident, but a meticulously calculated execution. The discovery that Sigfrido Garcia, a name previously unknown to the police, had rented the Toyota Prius completely changed the course of the investigation. Garcia, a medium-built man with a wary look and a record filled with minor infractions, was known for his ties to Catherine Magbanua, a figure who, in one way or another, always seemed to be at the center of dangerous intrigues. The detectives knew this was no mere coincidence. As they dug deeper, they uncovered something even more disturbing, a connection between Garcia and the Adelson family. The previously scattered connections began to align in an eerily logical way, pointing to a plot far more elaborate than anyone could have imagined. Garcia's bank records revealed suspicious transfers received from an account indirectly linked to Wendy Adelson. The amounts were small enough not to raise suspicions at first glance, but when added up, they indicated a steady flow of money that had been ongoing for months. Additionally, messages retrieved from seized devices showed vague yet revealing conversations between Garcia and an anonymous contact who, according to investigators, could be someone from the Adelson family. In one such message, sent weeks before the crime, Garcia wrote, "Everything is ready. Just waiting for the green light." The detectives knew they were facing something much bigger, a crime involving not only betrayal and resentment but also a carefully orchestrated conspiracy. As investigators connected the dots, it became clear that Garcia did not act alone. Catherine Magbanua, the ex-girlfriend, was the bridge between him and the real mastermind. She had privileged access to Wendy and Daniel's lives, knew their routines, their weaknesses. The tumultuous relationship between Wendy and Daniel was the perfect motivation for a crime like this. When confronted, Wendy denied any involvement, but the evidence told a different story. The police's suspicions turned into certainties, and the net was closing in quickly. The case was no longer just about a murder. It was about revenge, money, and a plan involving more people than anyone had imagined. And as investigators prepared to make an arrest, one question still lingered in the air. How far was Wendy willing to go to escape her past? Charlie Adelson had always been the kind of person who loved to draw attention, a man with an easy smile, impeccable clothing, and a charm that masked a calculating personality. But to the detectives handling the Martel case, he was much more than a protective brother. He was a possible accomplice. The police had already been suspicious of his close relationship with Wendy, but it was an intercepted phone call that raised a red flag. In the recording, Charlie spoke in a casual, almost mocking tone about hiring someone to solve the problem once and for all. Although it was said jokingly, to the investigators, no word seemed innocent. After all, Charlie's hatred for Daniel Martel was a poorly kept secret within the family. He never hid his disdain for his sister's ex-husband and often joked about how much easier things would be if he simply disappeared. The line between a joke and a threat became even thinner when detectives started following the money trail. Suspicious banking transactions appeared in his accounts, cash deposits in small amounts, transfers to third-party accounts that, when investigated, had indirect connections to Sigfrido Garcia. One particular transaction caught their attention, a significant cash withdrawal made weeks before the crime. The pattern of transactions indicated a clear attempt at concealment, small sums on alternating dates, using different accounts. The police knew Charlie was smart, but he underestimated the investigators' ability to connect the dots. More than that, he hadn't counted on the interception of other messages suggesting internal pressure to make sure everything was done cleanly. As the noose tightened, detectives began mapping Charlie's influence over Wendy. He had always been the big brother who solved problems, willing to do anything for family, even if it meant crossing the line into crime. Witnesses reported that after Wendy's divorce, he became obsessed with knowing every detail about Daniel, even hiring a private investigator to track his movements. The motivation? Revenge? protection, or simple desire for control. Perhaps it was a little of everything. With growing police pressure, Wendy began to show increasing signs of instability, and Charlie knew that at any moment she could crumble and drag him down with her. Now, the detectives were facing a complex family web, where each new revelation made the case even more intricate, and with every step, the truth seemed closer to coming to light. The interrogation room was filled with a heavy silence when Luis Rivera finally broke the ice. Sitting on the other side of the table, he rubbed his sweaty hands together, his gaze lost among the papers scattered in front of him. The detectives watched him expectantly, knowing that this moment could be the final piece to unravel the entire plot. Rivera, a weary-looking man with tattoos covering his arms and the expression of someone who had seen it all, took a deep breath before speaking. "I didn't want to get involved in this, but they gave me no choice." His voice carried a mix of fear and resignation. He knew that by opening his mouth, he was signing his life sentence outside of prison, and possibly inside a coffin. The pressure was immense, but the promise of a reduced sentence spoke louder. As the minutes passed, Rivera detailed the scheme with frightening precision. Daniel Martel's death was not a random crime or a last-minute decision. It was something meticulously planned by the Adelson family, who saw Martel as an obstacle impossible to overcome in any other way. Charlie Adelson was the one who gave the order. He wanted to ensure that Wendy had full custody of the children and eliminate any legal threats Daniel might pose. According to Rivera, meetings were held in discreet locations, and every detail was discussed to exhaustion: schedules, weapons, escape routes. Sigfrido Garcia, his partner in crime, was the perfect hitman. He knew how to act quickly, without raising suspicion. "They told me it was just a job, easy, no complications. But deep down, I knew no one comes out clean from something like this," Rivera confessed, staring at his hands, as if still trying to wash away a crime that was now deeply embedded in his soul. The detectives listened attentively, taking notes, while Rivera continued unraveling the plot as if shedding a heavy burden. "Wendy. She knew everything," he stated, letting the suspense hang in the air. According to him, Wendy was aware of the plan but preferred to stay in the background, letting Charlie Adelson coordinate every step. The bank transactions, the suspicious meetings, the Toyota Prius circling the neighborhood, it was all part of a macabre game where Martel never stood a chance. Rivera described the tension of the crime night, the exact moment he knew there was no turning back. "I saw the look in his eyes. He knew he was going to die. And we just did what we had to do." The raw and straightforward confession made Detective Harper exchange a satisfied glance with Ramos. They finally had what they needed. Now, it was only a matter of time before the Adelsons faced justice. Catherine Magbanua sat before the detectives with a rigid posture, her dark eyes scanning the room as if searching for an invisible exit. The sweat glistening on her forehead betrayed the image of self-confidence she tried to maintain. The police had already cornered Sigfrido Garcia and Luis Rivera, and now it was her turn. As the intermediary between the Adelson family and the hitmen, Catherine knew she was in a delicate position. The evidence against her was solid: intercepted messages, suspicious financial transactions, and security camera footage placing her in compromising locations in the days leading up to Daniel Martel's murder. "You know there's nowhere to run, Catherine," Detective Harper said, sliding a folder filled with documents across the table. "We just want to hear your side before it's too late." Catherine's once sharp and confident responses began to falter. She tried to maintain the narrative that she was just a close friend of the Adelson family, someone who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But as the police pressed her with increasingly specific details, her story started to crumble. The bank transfers from Charlie Adelson to her account were just the tip of the iceberg. Phone records showed frequent conversations between her, Garcia, and Rivera in the weeks leading up to the crime. Catherine shook her head, denying any direct involvement, but the detectives knew they were close to making her confess. "You know it wasn't just about the money, Catherine. You were in this up to your neck," Ramos stated, leaning forward, his eyes locked onto hers. "You were there to make sure everything went according to plan." The pressure was mounting, and Catherine felt the weight of the accusations suffocating her. Her relationship with Sigfrido Garcia was the missing piece of the puzzle. It wasn't just about money. There were personal ties, shared histories, and a trust that, in the end, sealed Daniel Martel's fate. Rivera had already spilled his part, and the detectives knew Catherine was the last remaining link between the Adelson family and the hitmen. Pressured, her hands trembled slightly in her lap, and her eyes betrayed a growing fear. The police knew she was the weakest link in the chain. With a few more pushes, she would start talking, and when she did, it would be the end for Charlie and Wendy Adelson. The silence in the room was almost unbearable, and Catherine knew she was facing the most important decision of her life, to talk or to fall alone. La Dolce Vita was the kind of restaurant where people like Charlie Adelson felt at home, a sophisticated atmosphere, with soft lighting, quality wine, and waiters who knew when to disappear. It was the perfect setting for discreet conversations, or at least that's what Charlie thought. Sitting at a table in the back, he gestured with the confidence of someone who believed he was in control, while Catherine Magbanua nervously fiddled with her napkin. What neither of them knew was that, at that very moment, the police were just steps away from putting together the final pieces of the puzzle. A hidden microphone captured every word, every forced laugh, every tension-filled pause. "They're tightening the noose," murmured Catherine, her gaze shifting to the restaurant entrance. Charlie, on the other hand, maintained his composure, as if the world around him was just a temporary inconvenience. "Relax, they have nothing solid." But the recording told a different story. The police listened intently to every phrase spoken that night, and what seemed like a casual conversation between acquaintances turned into a meticulous confession. Charlie spoke confidently about making sure no one talks and keeping things under control. He joked, with his usual sarcasm, about how lawyers could fix everything with a little money, but there was something in his voice that revealed the true panic behind the confident smile. Catherine, on the other hand, showed growing concern, mentioning the pressure she was feeling, the suspicious looks from the police, and the increasingly probing questions. "What if Rivera talks?" she whispered, gripping her glass tightly. Charlie's response was direct. "If he talks, we're screwed." That was the phrase that sealed his fate. The detectives analyzing the recording knew they had something solid in their hands. The family conspiracy, once just a tangle of suspicions and assumptions, was now captured in clear and undeniable audio. The restaurant, once considered a safe haven, had become the stage where Charlie and Catherine exposed their guilt in an irrefutable manner. With this evidence, the police could move forward with formal arrests, dismantling the web of lies that upheld the Adelsons' false innocence. The final move was about to happen, and while Charlie finished his wine with a false sense of security, the detectives knew his freedom was coming to an end. The case was finally nearing an inevitable conclusion, and this time there would be no escape. The sun had barely risen when detectives knocked on Charlie Adelson's door. The quiet street, which usually saw only the discreet movements of neighbors heading to work, was now filled with patrol cars and uniformed officers. Charlie, still groggy, opened the door with a nervous smile, trying to maintain his composure. But the game was over. "Mr. Adelson, you are under arrest for the murder of Daniel Martel." The words hit like a hammer, driving the final nail into a coffin. Neighbors peeked through their curtains, shocked, as Charlie was handcuffed on the porch of his luxury home. He tried to argue, to say there had been a mistake, but the officers were relentless. With the evidence obtained from the Dolce Vita recording, there were no more loopholes to escape. Almost simultaneously, Catherine Magbanua was taken by surprise in her apartment. Unlike Charlie, she did not try to argue. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed on the ground as she listened to the detectives read her rights. The pressure had finally reached its limit. The time for secrets and conspiracies was over, and now she would face the reality of a cold, impersonal jail cell. The press quickly caught wind of the arrests, and the news spread like wildfire. Reporters crowded outside the police station, eager for any details they could squeeze out of officials. Headlines blared phrases like family conspiracy, cold-blooded murder, and justice for Daniel Martel. But while Charlie and Catherine faced the full weight of the law, one name continued to raise doubts: Wendy Adelson. Despite growing suspicions, Wendy was still free, though under heavy surveillance. The police knew her involvement ran deeper than it seemed, but so far they didn't have enough evidence for a formal arrest. Detectives followed her closely, watching every step, every suspicious move. She continued trying to maintain a normal life, but the net was closing in. Deep down, Wendy knew it was only a matter of time before her own freedom became an illusion. Meanwhile, the arrests of Charlie and Catherine brought temporary relief to Daniel Martel's family, but also left one lingering question: how many secrets were still to come? Justice was only beginning its work, and everyone knew that the final outcome could be even more surprising. The courtroom was packed. The tension was almost palpable, filling every inch of the room with an invisible weight. Journalists, onlookers, and Daniel Martel's family jostled for space in the benches, eager to witness the unfolding of the trial that promised to expose the darkest secrets of the Adelson family. At the prosecution's table, the attorneys were prepared. Files meticulously organized, carefully edited videos, and bank statements meticulously analyzed. Each piece of the puzzle would be laid bare for the jury. The lead prosecutor, a woman with an unforgiving expression, opened the session with a phrase that echoed throughout the courtroom: "Ladies and gentlemen, the murder of Daniel Martel was not an impulsive act. It was an orchestrated conspiracy, carefully planned and financed by those who should have protected him." The first witnesses were called, each adding layers to the narrative the prosecution was building. Luis Rivera, now a state witness, revealed chilling details about the plan. With his hoarse voice and tired eyes, he described how Charlie Adelson coordinated the payments, how Catherine Magbanua acted as the link between those involved, and how Sigfrido Garcia executed the crime with near-professional precision. They wanted him out of the way. They wanted the kids. Nothing else mattered, Rivera said, staring at the floor, as if reliving every detail of that fateful night. The recordings from Dolce Vita were played, and the ensuing silence was deafening. Every word spoken by Charlie and Catherine was an incontestable piece of the conspiracy, and the jury absorbed every detail with growing indignation. The financial evidence was the final nail in the coffin. Bank statements revealed suspicious transfers, cash withdrawals, and concealment attempts that directly linked Charlie Adelson to financing the crime. The prosecution laid out each transaction like unfolding a map of the crime, connecting every point with surgical precision. Wendy, sitting in the gallery, kept her gaze fixed on the floor for most of the trial. The prosecutors spared no effort in insinuating her involvement, but without concrete proof, she remained a figure shrouded in suspicion but still outside prison walls. Charlie and Catherine's expressions fluctuated between coldness and resignation, as if they knew the truth was finally coming to light, and there was nowhere left to run. As the trial progressed, the defense attempted to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that Rivera was only trying to save himself, and that the financial transactions were just unfortunate coincidences. But the prosecution's narrative was too solid to be undone by mere conjectures. Each day, the sense that justice was finally being served grew among those present. The judge, impassive, absorbed every argument, every piece of evidence presented. And when the prosecutor closed her argument with a cutting statement, this crime was not just an act of revenge, it was a deliberate choice by a family that placed power and ambition above human life. Everyone in the room knew that the verdict was imminent. The courtroom was in absolute silence when the jury returned with the verdict. Everyone in the room seemed to hold their breath, as if time had frozen in that crucial moment. Charlie Adelson maintained a rigid expression, but the slight tremor in his hands revealed the nervousness behind his confident facade. Catherine Magbanua, sitting next to her lawyers, could barely disguise her lost look, as if still searching for an escape that no longer existed. The judge, with a firm and unwavering tone, read the verdict aloud, guilty of conspiracy and first-degree murder. Murmurs echoed through the room, and an audible sigh of relief came from Daniel Martel's family. Justice had finally been served. Charlie kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, but it was evident that the decision had shattered any hope he still harbored. His sentence was clear: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Catherine received the same fate. When the sentence was pronounced, tears silently streamed down her face, but there was no more room for regrets. The case, which began as a complex investigation full of twists and turns, had culminated in the conviction of the main perpetrators. The prosecution celebrated the outcome, emphasizing that justice had prevailed and that Daniel Martel's death would not go unpunished. However, there was a presence in the room that, despite the convictions, still loomed like an unsettling shadow: Wendy Adelson. Sitting among the spectators, Wendy maintained a composed posture, but her eyes betrayed growing unease. She had repeatedly denied any involvement in the crime, but doubts persisted. The media quickly turned their attention to her, and reporters whispered theories about her possible participation. Despite the lack of concrete evidence that could bring her to trial, prosecutors had made it clear that the investigation into her role was far from over. "Just because she got away today doesn't mean she'll get away forever," one of the detectives whispered to a colleague while watching Wendy leave the courtroom. She knew that her freedom was fragile, and that any misstep could be enough to bring new charges against her. With Charlie and Catherine behind bars, the neighborhood of Trescott Drive could finally breathe a sigh of relief, but the feeling that the story wasn't truly over still lingered in the air. Wendy continued her life, trying to rebuild a normal routine under the constant weight of suspicion. With every step, every sideways glance on the street, she knew she would never truly be free. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was only a matter of time before the whole truth came to light. The Martel case left deep scars on everyone involved, and even with the convictions, the question that remained was, had all the guilty parties truly been held accountable? The morning bustle at Miami International Airport was intense, with hurried travelers and announcements echoing through the boarding corridors. Among the passengers, a discreet figure tried to blend into the crowd. Donna Adelson, wearing dark sunglasses and a silk scarf carefully positioned around her neck, clutched her suitcase tightly, as if the destination ahead was safer than anything she was leaving behind. But the police were one step ahead. Within minutes, agents surrounded the area, blocking exits and monitoring every suspicious move. When her name was called over the loudspeaker for a security check, Donna froze for a moment. She knew this was the end of the line. Federal agents intercepted her before she could board her flight to Dubai, a destination meticulously chosen to evade extradition. Her previously composed expression crumbled the moment she was handcuffed. "Donna Adelson, you are under arrest for conspiracy and obstruction of justice," one of the officers said as they discreetly led her down an isolated corridor, away from the prying eyes of other passengers. She tried to mumble an explanation, but her voice failed. What began as an attempt to escape quietly ended in public humiliation. Reporters were already waiting outside, ready to capture every second of the arrest of the woman many considered to be the real mastermind behind the crime that destroyed Daniel Martel's life. The investigation revealed that Donna had transferred large sums of money to offshore accounts in the weeks prior, raising suspicions that she was planning to flee the country. The tracking of these financial movements, combined with an anonymous tip, led the police to closely monitor her steps. The escape plan, carefully crafted, was thwarted at the last moment. As Donna was escorted out of the airport, her daughter Wendy watched the scene from a distance, hidden behind a column, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. She knew that the noose was tightening around her. Her mother's arrest not only deepened the scandal, but also put new pressure on her own version of the story. Donna Adelson's capture was hailed as a triumph for the prosecution, which considered her a key player in the conspiracy to eliminate Daniel Martel. Witnesses claimed that she had an active role in the decisions leading up to the crime, manipulating information and encouraging her children to take extreme measures to ensure Wendy had custody of the children. To many, her attempt to flee was the ultimate confirmation of her guilt. Now, with the Adelson matriarch in custody, authorities were closer than ever to closing one of the most intricate cases in the city. Although everyone knew that until the last secret was uncovered, the story was far from over. Chapter 15. The Mystery Remains. Even after the convictions of Charlie Adelson, Catherine Magbanua, and Donna Adelson, a shadow still lingered over the case. Wendy Adelson remained an unsettling mystery, dividing opinions between those who believed in her innocence and those who saw her as the true architect of the crime. In the streets of Trescott Drive, conversations still revolved around the same question: did she really know nothing? The media, relentless as ever, dug into every detail of the trial, recalling moments when Wendy's statement seemed contradictory, her demeanor too calculated, her expression impassive when confronted with accusations against her family. For many, her freedom was a mistake, a loophole in the justice system. For others, it was simply a lack of concrete evidence, and that doubt fueled a whirlwind of theories. Public speculation intensified even further when financial details began to emerge. Independent investigations revealed suspicious bank transfers that, while never directly linked to Wendy, seemed to benefit her in some way. Close friends reported that, even amid the chaos around her, she tried to maintain a normal routine, as if nothing had happened. But there was something different in her eyes, an uneasiness that couldn't be disguised. She avoided going out, avoided cameras, avoided any situation that could put her back in the spotlight. The feeling was that Wendy knew more than she was willing to admit, and perhaps, just perhaps, she was waiting for the right moment to disappear, just as her mother had tried to do. Prosecutors, despite being satisfied with the convictions obtained, had not entirely given up on Wendy. She remained under discreet surveillance, her movements analyzed, her communications monitored. Any slip-up could be the missing piece needed to close the case once and for all. But so far, she played the game of caution well, keeping her distance from any direct link to Daniel Martel's murder. The children, now under the care of distant relatives, would grow up under the shadow of this brutal crime, never truly knowing their mother's role in the tragedy that destroyed their family. Thus, the Martel case continued to echo, even after the courtroom doors had closed. Doubts lingered, secrets seemed buried, but never completely forgotten. The city knew that sooner or later, the truth would find its peculiar way of emerging, whether through a late confession or a previously overlooked detail. Meanwhile, Wendy Adelson walked a fine line, between freedom and guilt, between doubt and truth. The mystery remained, and with it, the uncomfortable feeling that justice might not have been fully served. If you enjoyed this video and want to keep exploring scary and intriguing stories, don't forget to subscribe to the Spooky Stories channel and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss any of the darkest mysteries and chilling events we share here. And, of course, leave your comment. Which part of this story gave you the biggest chills? Or is there a case you'd like us to cover? Share your ideas and join our community. And don't stop here. Click on the video now appearing on your screen and keep diving into the most spine-tingling stories we've selected just for you. With every click, you get closer to the unknown. And remember, here at Spooky Stories, fear is just the beginning.